But on a more
Yeah.
serious note, um, in light of this re-release, a conversation I wasn't privy to back when the game first came out has resurfaced, and that's the intentional parallels between the conflict depicted in The Last of Us Part Two and the real life conflict between Israel and Palestine. I just
Oh.
pronounced that weird. I don't know why my mouth did that. Um, so there's a Vice article I would suggest reading by Emmanuel Myberg that describes these
Mm.
parallels, titled "The Not So Hidden Israeli Politics of The Last of Us Part 2." So the creative director of the game, Neil Druckmann, is of Israeli descent. He was born
Mm.
and raised in the West Bank before being moved to the U.S. by his parents. So he grew up
Mm-hmm.
in a household that kept tabs on this conflict, and as a result, drew from it for the story of this game. Um,
Right.
in The Last of Us Part Two, there are two groups that very clearly resemble Israel and Palestine: the Washington Liberation Front and the Seraphites. The WLF. Sorry, my neighbors be loud as hell sometimes. Um,
No worries.
but where was I? The WLF, or Wolves as they're called in the game, rebelled against the previous regime and took over Seattle, similar to the Zionists who fought against British rule. And the Seraphites, or Scars, are a religious group that are being discriminated against by the Wolves, causing conflict. And the problem um, is that the Last of Us takes a centrist approach to this conflict,
Mm-hmm.
an attempt to show the cycle of violence. And as Myberg expertly puts it, a cycle of violence is a tempting way to interpret this conflict, or any conflict, because it signals careful nuance while quietly squashing more difficult conversations.
Right.
This common centrist position on violent conflict, while better than absolute dehumanization, is coincidentally a worldview that allows conflicts to drag on forever. He continues to say that cycles of violence are a poor way to understand a conflict in a meaningful way, especially if one is interested in finding a solution. Just as the fantasy of escaping violence by simply walking away from it is one that only those with the means to do so can entertain, the myth of the cycle of
Right.
violence is one that benefits the side that can survive the status quo. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and Myberg still compliments the game for its strong and thought provoking storytelling, but ultimately he criticizes it for being too centrist and accepting intense hate that is universal as a fact of life rather than examining where and why this behavior is learned. I think I don't know if I mentioned it before, but Myberg is also Israeli. Um, this is a fiction story that takes inspiration from an ongoing real life conflict, so it's easy to, when you hear something like this, similar to with not similar because the reality is Blue Eye Samurai, Michael Green is a Zionist, but it's easy to
Right.
potentially assume that the people working on this are Zionists. But this is a story that's taking inspiration from it. It's not necessarily meant to be a direct copy. It's not meant to be
Right.
that conflict. It's just meant to be taking something that he is directly connected to as an Israeli person and incorporated in his work. So I
Right.
don't want people to jump to the conclusion that Neil Druckmann is a Zionist based on this, but I also, of course, don't want to make the mistake of putting him and his team on a pedestal. But I want to leave the door open for them to make a clear statement about the situation if they haven't already, because I'm not sure, before we all jump to conclusions. All right. um,
Mm.
Plus, I think that they did have a noble goal with this story, but ultimately it falls flat because they don't offer a solution. Instead, just go the world and people suck. That's how like the Last of Us Part Two is an overwhelmingly very cynical story. um, and Druckmann admitted to having this intense feeling of hate after seeing a video of the 2000 mob killing of the Israeli soldiers in Ramallah, and
Mm-hmm.
his disgust at his want for revenge in that moment um, was his inspiration for the first game, and
Right.
the themes of that very first game. Um, and Myberg says that it's clearly coming from an emotional, authentic, and self-examining place on Neil's part, but
Mm-hmm.
he kind of overcorrects, and by taking this very centrist point of view.
Right.
But even before I read this article, I started to get more of a firm grasp on the conflict between Israel and Palestine. but rooting it in a story that I love, and it really puts it into perspective and can hopefully
Mm.
do the same for other people if people have played that game and can kind of use that comparison to help them further understand this conflict and what's going on. It did that for me. And yeah, like I said, also this game is about it's about a world ravaged by a deadly pandemic that released during a deadly pandemic, and then coincidentally is re-releasing when this war that's been going on for decades is now like in the public eye. It's unfortunate that there's I was watching some people talk about this on YouTube, and one of them said that there's never a good time for this game to come out because this game is just sad.
Yeah.
It's just a big downer overall. It's why, even though I didn't feel this way at first, I hope that we get a third game. Because the first game was more evenly balanced between light and dark, whereas part two is kind of overwhelmingly dour. And I need a third game that, while dark, is more light than the previous two games to cap off the franchise. Part two was essentially the Empire Strike Back. Everybody's down in their luck. It's the second act low point, and now I need a third act triumph. I need a third
Right.
game that gives us all a lot more hope overall with the world instead of just going everything sucks. I still
Right.
do love The Last of Us Part Two though. It's my favorite of the two games so far. It's real good. But yeah, it definitely helps me put that whole conflict in perspective and have a better understanding of it, which I
Yeah.
didn't expect that at all.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see what I'll notice now that I have this information when I go back to play it when this comes out.